Hello and welcome to a conversation with the Middle East Monitor. I am Naseem Ahmed, your host today. We are discussing the backlash against Palestine solidarity, the topic of a new book by my guest, Dr. Hil Aked. Welcome to the show, Hil, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Hil is a writer and investigative researcher with a background in political sociology, who holds a PhD from the University of Bath and an MSc from SOAS here in London. He has conducted research on the Israeli lobby, Islamophobia, neoconservative think tanks, and the media, and of course the far right as well. And the title of the new book is Friends of Israel, the Backlash Against Palestine Solidarity. I mean, I should first of all begin by congratulating you for completing publishing what is a really fantastic book. I mean, I couldn't recommend it enough, which is why I wanted to read some of the blurbs from the back. This book expertly maps out the key figures supporting and defending the Israeli apartheid regime in Britain. That's Yara Harawi. This is the first book that examines closely and meticulously this campaign of suppression and silencing of Palestinian cause, as Ilan Pape. No one who reads Hil Aked's meticulously researched book can be left in any doubt about how Israel's friends operate to subvert British popular perceptions and the British political process in favor of Zionism. And that's Ghada Karmi. I just read out three of a number of blurbs on the book, which is, as I said, fantastic. So before we get going, speak about your interest, in studying this topic as a researcher, and how did this grow over time?
Yeah, I think it was a question I got asked quite a lot when I was doing the research, like, oh, are you Israeli? Are you Palestinian? Are you Muslim? Are you Jewish? Why do you care? And I'm none of those things. But Hassan Kanafani said that the Palestinian cause is not for Palestinians only, but a cause for every revolutionary, as a cause for, against exploitation and oppression. I got interested in it when I was doing my master's at SOAS because I was exposed to that, the issue, and I visited Palestine a couple of times. And I suppose what struck me was how ignorant I had been as a British person growing up, thinking I was very well informed, thinking I was very well educated. I was so shocked to see how horrific the reality and brutality of Israeli apartheid and colonialism was, that I did have some years ago. I had some idea that it was 6 of one, half dozen of the other, some kind of two sides thing, and that's not, of course, the reality. So then I came back to Britain and sort of engaged in some solidarity activism, where I came sort of face to face with pro-Israel actors, in civil society, and then I had the opportunity to undertake my doctoral research on this topic, and my thinking's developed a lot since then. But I came at the issue, as intellectually speaking, initially from a sort of political solidarity point of view.
And did you spend time in Palestine as well?
Yeah, not a huge amount of time, but I went to the West Bank twice in 2010 and learned a lot there. I recommend reading my book. There's loads of other brilliant good books by Palestinians and others out there, but really, going there and seeing it with your own eyes is such an education.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, and reading your book, one of the first things that struck me is you're very careful in use of terms. Like, for example, you don't like saying things like Israeli lobby. So why is it important to be clear about the terms we use, not to use, say, for example, Jewish lobby? A lot of people say the Jewish lobby. I think you're very careful not to use words like that, Israeli lobby, Jewish lobby. So why is it important to be very careful in how we use those terms?
Yeah, so I think Israeli lobby would imply that people lobbying for Israel in this country are Israeli, and they're predominantly not. There's a British Zionist movement that I study in the book, of British people, and then the idea of a Jewish lobby, I think, is largely an anti-Semitic myth. I think I do spend a fair bit of time talking about the very real history of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories, which focus on Jews' supposed ability to control the media or the banking industry, or sort of subvert government policies, those ideas cause harm to Jewish communities, and they're racist. So I differentiate very clearly what I'm talking about, which is the Zionist movement from Jewish communities. And Jewish communities, you know, like any community, like any minority community especially, do seek to represent themselves, and they have communal institutions. But like any community, there's actually a lot of division within the community, a lot of internal disagreement, especially on Israel. So I talk about how the younger generation in all of society, but including in the Jewish community, is increasingly pro-Palestinian. We've seen new groups like Namod and Judah springing up and actually challenging what has been a general support for Israel in the Jewish community for some years, although even that is important to understand, and I talk about this in the book. It is historically contingent, and in the early years of the Zionist movement, mainstream Jewish communal institutions were not in favor of Zionism. It's only when Jews face increasing persecution in Europe in the 30s and 40s, culminating in the Holocaust, that more people in the Jewish community pretty understandably feel like, okay, we do need some kind of safe haven, we need a state. And the fact that that has meant, you know, oppression and dispossession for Palestinians seemed less important, I think, for them at that time. So yeah, well, the Zionist movement maps onto political constituencies, not ethno-religious constituencies. So a really good example of this is the contemporary power of Christian Zionism in this country, which arguably predates Jewish support for Zionism. So Arthur Balfour and people like that historically, who issues the Balfour Declaration, are good examples of Christian Zionism historically. And today we've got groups like Christian Friends of Israel, Christians United for Israel, and also, you know, some of the foot soldiers of to the extent there is a grassroots movement in support of Israel, some of its most active sort of elements on the street are evangelical Christians.
Yeah, I mean, a phrase that's worth keeping in mind is that not all Jews are Zionist, and most Zionists are not Jews or Israelis, for that matter. You know, most Zionists, I would say, are American Christian evangelical, just in terms of numbers. You know, it's a huge number. But we are in it. It does pose a problem for people speaking about Israel, in the sense that the people that conflate Zionism and Judaism and Jews is really a lot of the pro-Israeli organizations, especially with things like the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, where you know, which at the heart of which is criticism of Israel, and there's a conflation there. 7 of the 11 examples does that. So I think, do you think the Israeli side is doing that as well, as much as, say, for example, pro-Palestinian activists? And from my experience, it seems like, you know, there's a concerted effort to regulate pro-Palestinian speech by putting criticism of Israel at the center of any center of a definition of anti-Semitism. I mean, do you think that's fair assessment?
I think that is fair to say, and I think it's a mark of the fact that defenders of Israeli apartheid have really no arguments left to try to justify the apartheid and policies imposed on Palestinians, and they are falling back on an attempt to conflate criticism of Israel or Zionism with anti-Semitism. And you know, I always make a point of prefacing any conversation of IHRA by saying, you know, real anti-Semitism is on the rise in Britain and in the world, and that's something we should be very vigilant against. And it's also true that the IHRA definition is a illegitimate attempt to kind of expand the definition of anti-Semitism, or to distort it away from hostility to Jews as Jews and into this idea that Israel is the collective Jew. And if you criticize it, you're criticizing Judaism somehow, rather than because of its oppressive policies towards Palestinians. And so the IHRA is a really, you know, a tragic episode in the racial history of the history of anti-racism. But it doesn't, I talk in the book about how it doesn't actually, it's not a complete aberration from Britain's toxic racial politics, right? So we saw the Sewell report a few years back tell communities of color in this country, oh, Britain's no longer institutionally racist. And that, you know, was called a form of racial gaslighting. And I don't think the IHRA is that different. It's the Israeli government and the Israeli government supporters around the world, including the British government, telling Palestinians that they can't talk about the Nakba, they can't talk about their racial oppression. And if they do, they're being racist somehow. So I don't think it's sort of unique to Israel. I think it's a mark of like the real kind of toxic racial politics we see in Britain, unfortunately.
Yeah, so let's get into your book. So what are the key facets of the pro-Israeli lobby?
Yeah, so well, I talk about, I sort of map the pro-Israel lobby or the Zionist movement out in detail in the book. Some of the oldest elements which still form the backbone of the Zionist movement today are so-called national institutions. So that is the World Zionist Organization, which was founded at the end of the 19th century by Theodor Herzl, one of the founders of the movement, and others. And then three other national institutions which kind of grow out of the World Zionist Organization. And they all have different functions. So the Jewish National Fund is established to essentially colonize Palestine. And there's a British affiliate, the JNF UK, which is a registered charity, by the way, outrageously. And then you've got the Jewish Agency, which is to facilitate Aliyah or emigration to Israel. And then Karen Hayesod, or the Foundation Fund, which is primarily a fundraising body. And they both, again, have British affiliates and affiliates in the US and elsewhere. So that's the kind of historical backdrop, and they're still very important institutions, but today they've been sort of supplemented by a host of newer organizations. And many of the organizations that we have today in the pro-Israel movement emerge quite closely from sort of state-private networks. So as an example, the groups that focus on Parliament, Conservative Friends of Israel and Labour Friends of Israel, certainly have quite close relationships with the Israeli embassy. In the context of Parliament, I'd also mention a group like Henry Jackson Society, which is, you know, a neoconservative body, also interested in stoking Islamophobia and draconian anti-terrorism and anti-extremism policies, but also, you know, strongly Zionist and strongly supportive of Israel. You've got media-focused groups like BICOM. You've got groups focused on bringing legal cases against Palestine Solidarity and BDS activism. So lawfare groups, UK Lawyers for Israel is a very, very active example. And there's a body called Jewish Human Rights Watch as well, which has brought some very significant legal cases, which we may talk about later. There's astroturfed hyperlocal groups, you know, like North London Friends of Israel, Inverness Friends of Israel. And I talk more about, if you want, later on why I call them astroturfed. And then you've got your identity-based groups, so the Christian Zionist-based groups I mentioned. And as you said, there are some Jewish communal bodies, such as the Board of Deputies, which, despite a history of not actually being very pro-Zionist, today does support Israel and presents that, or its leadership presents that, as a sort of intrinsic part of its advocacy for the Jewish community. But again, there's a lot of dissent within the board and within the wider Jewish community about whether that's something it should be doing or whether it should be left to the explicitly pro-Israel groups.
Yeah, and that's one of the real strength of the book, I think, and the clarifications of the various different organizations where they sit within the pro-Israel lobbying landscape, and how that's evolved over the decades. You of course, you know, look at pre-creation of Israel. You mentioned the JNF, World Zionist Organization. Just speak a little bit about how the main pro-Israeli Zionist organizations, like the World Zionist Organization, JNF, how they precede the state of Israel. So what's their role now? I mean, what happened to these big organizations after the creation of Israel?
Yeah, so they don't cease to exist when Israel is founded in 1948 and on the back of the expulsion of 750,000 Palestinians in the Nakba. What happens instead is that these laws are passed, such as, I think, if I'm remembering correctly, one is called the World Zionist Organization Jewish Agency Status Law. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit of a lag, actually, but I'll just keep talking. These laws are passed which codify their relationship to the newly founded state of Israel and essentially set out a sort of division of labor, where they share power with the government and perform certain functions alongside the government. So, for example, the JNF today in Israel is a leading actor in ethnic cleansing in areas like the Negev or the Nakab Desert, where it's seeking to sort of Judaize those areas and input Israeli settlers and get rid of Palestinian Bedouins who live in those areas. And it can do that with the tacit support of the state, but sometimes separately too. And there are many kind of advantages to the Israeli government of having a sort of somewhat independent organizations carrying out these functions, because it allows the government itself a degree of deniability, and those actors often have more flexibility. And in civil society around the world, the civil society organizations have more legitimacy, are treated with more credibility than out and out representations of the Israeli government. So, but they're sort of, as I say, I talk in the book about state-private networks in which they sort of loosely coordinate their activities.
And that's an important point there. The way you frame the existence or explain the existence of civil society organizations advocating for Israel and genuine grassroots civil society organization, basically bottom-up civil society versus top-down. Just clarify that for us, and why it's important to understand that many of the pro-Israeli organizations are very much top-down civil society groups, clashing with bottom-up, who are less resourced and less connected, and they're very much fighting with their arms behind their back. So explain that for us.
Yeah, so I suppose in essence, the power asymmetry that we see in Palestine, where Israel is a powerful, highly militarized state, and Palestinians are indigenous population with very little to defend themselves, being occupied. That power imbalance is seen in the sort of solidarity movements, their respective solidarity movements around the world. So the pro-Israel movement can draw on superior resources, has superior access to state power, and tends to win support in arenas at the top of society. So in Westminster, for example, it's fairly well supported, has bipartisan support. University management tends to be quite easy to win over. In sort of undemocratic media institutions, the pro-Israel movement can have a lot of sway. On the other hand, Palestinians gain support in civil society from ordinary people, often from marginalized folk, from communities of color who have an affinity to the Palestinian cause, and they organize and try to build power, and increasingly launch boycott, divestment, sanctions, BDS initiatives in civil society arenas, such as students on campus as opposed to university management, or cultural arenas, religious institutions, other kind of civil society places. And that's where we're seeing interesting contestation happen. And you see British government actors, civil society pro-Israel groups sort of intervening to try to stamp out those initiatives, and often coming at it from a more top-down place, whether that's by, as I said, leveraging kind of British government support, threatening cultural institutions, funding, all kinds of essentially bullying tactics.
Yeah, a classic example of that would be the adoption of a really controversial definition of, I would say, anti-Semitism, pressuring universities. So it's very much top-down regulatory enforcement way of regulating the free spaces in civic society. And you see that here, you see in the US. That's a very important point which you highlight in the book. And
I would say that, universities were, for good reason, resisting the adoption of the IHRA until I think Gavin Williamson, who was then Education Secretary, threatens their funding. So it's sheer bullying, and it fits with a wider sort of pattern of authoritarianism that the British government is engaging in. Yeah.
So we spoke about the Zionist lobby, how it's been around it predates the state of Israel itself. You point out that something happened in 2005, and brand Israel was at threat. Israel's reputation around the world plummeted, and a lot of these smaller pro-Israel Zionist organization kicked off to, in a sense, shield, put a firewall around Israel's reputation. Not that they're succeeding, but brand Israel project really kicked off. So when did it kick off, and why did it kick off the way it did?
So, to go back in history a little bit, Israel is seen for many years as sort of left-wing socialist enclave, and that kind of myth seeps away during decades of occupation and violence. By about the year 2000, the sham Oslo peace process has collapsed. The second intifada has erupted and been brutally repressed. And what you see is that the two-state solution, which has been what international governments have said for a long time is going to be the outcome in Israel-Palestine, is increasingly acknowledged to be unattainable and actually undesirable as well. And more acknowledgement is had of the fact that we have a one-state reality already in Israel-Palestine, and that reality is an apartheid reality. And so Israel and the Zionist project enters a crisis of legitimacy, and it's a sort of national security threat in itself. Simultaneously, as Omar Barghouti talks about, who's one of the leaders of the BDS movement, Palestinian resistance is entering a qualitatively new phase of its resistance. So popular committees are organizing non-violent weekly demonstrations, and the BDS call is made in 2005. And it goes as a social movement through a very classic pattern. I think, the classic pattern being, first they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, and then you win. And so in those early years, they're hoping to ignore BDS. And instead they launched the Brand Israel project, which is an official nation branding scheme, which seeks to hires professional PR companies and engages non-governmental organizations in, trying to change Israel's image and take it, quote unquote, beyond the conflict. So they, emphasize LGBTQ plus rights and do a lot of pink washing. They emphasize women's rights. They emphasize how they're green and environmentally friendly. They talk about, Israel being the startup nation and, high-tech capacities, anything but to acknowledge the apartheid that's being imposed on Palestinians. But yeah, as you said, it doesn't work because people aren't stupid, and Palestinians have continued to resist and continue to highlight the fact that that they're being oppressed. And so in around 2010, you see a turn to more oppressive tactics, both against Palestinian civil society within Israel-Palestine and against BDS activists around the world. So the blacklisting of BDS activists and spying techniques, NSO spyware has been exported to many repressive governments around the world and is used on Palestinians themselves and potentially on, human rights activists abroad, or we don't know that for sure. But Israel starts, using more intentionally trying to institutionalize cooperation with civil society actors, with schemes like the Global Coalition for Israel. And it sets up a Ministry of Strategic Affairs and funds that quite heavily to wage a war on BDS. And it uses sometimes sort of Mossad-style tactics. And then that still isn't working after years of doing these kind of, as you say, quite aggressive tactics. But by, I can't remember exactly when this is founded, but an organization called Concert, originally named Keller Shlomo or Solomon Sling, is set up. And that is essentially a vehicle through which the Israeli government can indirectly and covertly fund pro-Israel groups. And still, they're not actually managing to defeat the BDS movement or to lay the decline in Israel's image, which shows you that I think, reality matters no matter how much PR you sort of throw at it.
Yeah. What are some of those tools? I mean, you mentioned some of them, and another, I think, is lawfare. The motto being, bankrupt each pro-Palestinian organizations one at a time, something along that line. There was a clip going around social media a couple of weeks ago, UK lawyer, which was an event that was held by UK Lawyers for Israel. I don't think they wanted it, captured and disseminated, but it was somehow captured, and they said something like, bankrupt labor for its anti-Semitism, something along that line. So what is lawfare, and how are they trying to do that, bankrupt pro-Palestinian organizations, and what are some of the examples you highlight in your book?
So lawfare is quite a difficult term to pin down, and I sort of trace its history to the War on Terror and the US government-led erosion of international law. In the kind of Israeli political lexicon, it also comes out of sort of War on Terror original thinking, but swiftly moves on to attacks on nonviolent activism such as BDS. And it's essentially the use of the law to achieve oppressive political ends. So I suppose there are two main kind of functions or I draw that are sort of offensive or defensive types of lawfare. Offensive lawfare being attempts to prosecute supporters of Palestinian rights or boycott, divestment, sanctions. And you mentioned UK Lawyers for Israel. They're a very, very active group attacking, not only activism, in fact, but just sheer humanitarianism. So they frequently launch complaints to the Charity Commission to try and get them to investigate, humanitarian organizations supporting Palestinian, life, and also even just sheer expressions of Palestinian identity. So quite recently, they also got some artwork by children in Gaza removed from a children's hospital in Britain. That's the level at which we're talking. And then another important example is an organization called Jewish Human Rights Watch brought a case against Leicester City Council and 2 Welsh councils a while back to try to say that they should not be allowed to adopt elements of boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and that actually somehow it was contrary to the Equality Act and anti-Semitic discrimination for them to be doing this, and that was thrown out of court. There's been a long-running appeal, but eventually the Supreme Court upheld the right to boycott. On the flip side, because that stuff has failed, you've seen a sort of another form of lawfare, which is an attempt to outlaw BDS. So we've actually seen in recent days the British government say it is finally going to table legislation to tell local councils they're not allowed to take ethical issues into account when it comes to their procurement policies or their pension pots. And this has been put forward by figures like Michael Gove in the British government. And it speaks to a wider, as I've mentioned already, I think, authoritarianism and racism in this government we have today. And there's a big right to boycott campaign resisting that. And it's not just Palestine solidarity organizations, but also organizations that want to see ethical issues taken into account when it comes to fossil fuel divestments, and the climate crisis, or the arms trade, or big tobacco lobbies and public health campaigners. So I think that's a positive development, despite the repression. The sort of essentially social justice organizations and anti-racism organizations working together because we need to resist that repression.
Do you see no overlap? I mean, one of the things that's been happening in the Middle East following the Arab Spring is how authoritarian regimes learn from their failures. Do you think Israel is learning from the failure of South Africa? Do you see overlaps? Do you see them actually using tactics that worked then and modifying tactics that failed to basically fend themselves defeat the BDS movement? Do you see any overlap and that kind of tactic?
It's a really interesting question. I'm not sure if they've learned from the South African example, but I certainly draw a parallel in the book between not only the well-established now fact that Israel is practicing apartheid as defined in international law against Palestinians, just as the white Afrikaners regime did against Black South Africans, but also that the way the 2 apartheid governments fought back against the boycott campaigns, which targeted them, is very, very similar. So South Africa also covertly funded civil society organizations, made very cynical use of racial optics. So they used to sort of try and put Black PR operatives at the front of their campaigns to say that white minority rule was great, actually. And you see Israel engaging in similar tactics. So I wouldn't say if they had learnt the lessons, they would know that is not going to work over time. But actually, I think they are kind of quite unconsciously engaging in the same things, because that's, I suppose, what apartheid states do.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons they're so critical of the human rights organization is because the narrative of apartheid, they want to dismiss it outright by denouncing Human Rights Watch, Amnesty as anti-Semitic, and that's a narrative that's gaining traction on social media. And I see a lot of pro-Israeli organizations and advocates who basically denounce Amnesty as anti-Semitic. So block or don't allow the narrative to gain traction. That seems to be the strategy. I don't know how long that would last. How much sympathy do you have with people who say a powerful example of how the pro-Israeli lobby carries out its activities is the treatment of Jeremy Corbyn? Do you have sympathy with that? Is it, in your view, a good example of here in the UK how the pro-Israeli lobby managed to gain a major victory?
So I guess what I would expect is, for us to, I think it's really important to be precise and specific about evidence and not make sort of ground sweeping statements without that evidence. And I do understand the appeal of that sort of narrative, and it sort of emerges from the question cui bono, right? Who benefits? And clearly Jeremy Corbyn is and always has been a strong ally of the Palestinian people. When he became leader of the Labour Party, he didn't attend a Labour Friends of Israel reception, which is quite unheard of for a Labour leader. He skipped the Balfour 100 anniversary celebration that they held in 2017, and therefore obviously the pro-Israel lobby hates him and the Israeli government hates him. And he also had a much wider agenda. He wanted to democratize the Labour Party. He wanted to challenge neoliberalism and economic inequality in this country. And so, yes, pro-Israel actors had a role within the Labour Party, but I think it would overstate their power to say that, they took him down alone. Actually, it was a much wider right-wing coalition, and it was about much more than just Palestine, although I think, again, I think it's very important to say that, the idea of anti-Semitism in Labour was not a smear. I think we should not say that. It has a very long history, which I talk about in the book, and it is a real phenomenon still today in the Labour Party, as are many other forms of racism, by the way, which barely get mentioned. And at the same time, it's also true that it was weaponized, and not just by supporters of Israel, but by other opponents of Jeremy Corbyn, just very, very cynically, people who don't, I think, care about racism at all. And so the whole episode is quite tragic for the cause of anti-racism in this country. And the IHRA victory, which we talked about a little bit, it was a victory for the forces which wish to support Israel by conflating criticism of Israel with anti-Semitism. But as I've already said, it's not unique within the gaslighting and toxic racial politics of this country. And so I guess there is some evidence, but it's quite limited. We did see Shai Masot, who was an Israeli government representative, very explicitly plotting to sort of quote unquote take down British politicians who were sympathetic.
That was in 2017, I think.
Yeah, but besides specific examples like that, we have limited evidence, and I think the evidence is vital. So I think it'd be a little bit reductionist to attribute Jeremy Corbyn's rise and fall to the Israel lobby alone. I think it was a much wider coalition of the right-wing media, the right wing of the Labour Party, and obviously the Tory party who wants to bring him down.
Yeah, and we are running out of time. So just to end our conversation, you conclude by talking about the threat of democracy. Describe that for us. And what is the threat of democracy that you outline in your book?
So essentially what I mean by that is, I think I've already mentioned that, in the last analysis, the situation in Israel-Palestine is one of grossly unequal power dynamics at the root of the injustice. And that's mirrored in the pro-Israel and pro-Palestinian movements around the world. And pro-Israel movements and pro-Israel advocacy sort of flourishes in anti-democratic arena, whereas the latter gain support at the grassroots, the Palestinian cause. And so I think it kind of reflects on British society and the fact that our media institutions, our universities, and indeed our foreign policy within the Westminster establishment are extremely undemocratic. There's a real democratic deficit. There's a crisis of democracy in this country. And so what is interesting in the fact that Palestinians have turned to civil society rather than governments to be allies and to actually assist in hopefully their liberation ultimately, is that they've put their faith there because governments, are not bringing about justice and are not reflecting popular will. And so I think BDS has a role to play in supporting Palestinians' liberation struggle, but also it can be a democratizing force in this country, because we essentially be holding corporate and political power to account until forcing it to sort of reflect actual popular opinion, so that one day, hopefully, foreign policy of this country would reflect the fact that overwhelmingly British people want justice for the Palestinians.
Yes, so we are at the end of our time. I want to say thank you again for joining us, Hil. I highly recommend the book. It came out, I think, just earlier this year. When was it? 2 months ago?
Yeah, just over a month, actually. Is that right? Yeah.
Yeah, a month ago. So yeah, do buy the book and have a read. It will. It's a fantastic book, and lots of diagrams explaining exactly how the pro-Israeli lobby operates. And I want to thank you all again, and see you all again soon. Thank you very much, and goodbye.